Hello guys, my name is Mark Chanot. I'm an 8th grade social studies teacher at Farragut Middle School. Today we're going to be doing summer task number 3 for 8th grade social studies. And that task is to learn about some of the battles fought in the American Civil War. So let's get right to it. All righty guys, got a PowerPoint for you. We're going to go over some stuff. Hopefully you'll enjoy this presentation. I only have about 30 minutes, so we're going to have to go pretty quick. And there's the home page, obviously, right there. If this video is hard to understand, there's some options for you. And obviously, you can pause this video anytime you want to pause it, especially you're going to have to pause it a couple times for activities, but you do what you need to do. It's your video. All right. Stuff you're going to need, some supplies for this lesson. You're going to need a pencil and paper, a pair of scissors, glue stick or tape, either one will work, and the printed pages from the KCS at-home website. There's a page on the Emancipation Proclamation, one on the Gettysburg Address, and a Civil War card sort activity that you need to get from the district website in order to do this. All right, so here we go. It's the battles of the Civil War. There were thousands of battles in the Civil War. It's to condense the battles of the Civil War into 30 minutes is impossible to do. So I have chosen 4 that we're going to cover: Bull Run, Shiloh, Antietam, and Gettysburg. And then we're going to talk about Appomattox Courthouse, also technically not a battle, but it's where the war effectively ended. So again, today's lesson is the battles of the Civil War, and we'll move right on. The objective for this lesson, we're going to evaluate important Civil War battles and understand their significance. And real quick review, I know in task 2, you guys learned about the leaders of the Civil War. And in task 1, we covered the election of 1860, secession, and Fort Sumter. And so I'd like to review that real quick because before that, obviously, there weren't any battles. Lincoln was elected in November of 1860. South Carolina had threatened that if he is elected, they were going to secede. He was elected, and South Carolina held good to her word and seceded from the Union. She wasn't alone. 6 other states left too. By the time Lincoln arrived in Washington, there were 7 states that had left the Union. And as March bled into April, a federal fort in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, Fort Sumter, became an important place. That is where Union troops held out, and the government and Confederate government wanted that fort evacuated. Lincoln ordered his men to hold and possess the fort, and on April 12, 1861, the Confederates opened fire on Fort Sumter, leading to the Civil War. So, and that's a quick review. After Fort Sumter is where we're going to start today. After Fort Sumter, Lincoln's immediate reaction was to call for 75,000 volunteers to join the army and put down the rebellion. Each state was given a certain number of troops that they were supposed to furnish to the government, and this 75,000 was filled very quickly. Almost every 18 to 25-year-old male in the United States joined the army. The northern boys joined the Union Army, and southern boys joined the Confederate Army. In fact, it was these quotas were filled so quickly. In Ohio, it only took 16 days for the state to send its quota of troops. The slave states didn't respond to Lincoln's call for volunteers in the same way. And you see a quote here. The state of Kentucky said that they will furnish no troops for the wicked purpose of subduing her sister southern states. One of the effects of Lincoln's call, obviously, was the creation of an army. But another effect was that 4 more southern states left the Union, seceded from the Union. These include Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and the 11th and last southern state to leave the Union was our dear state of Tennessee. At this time, guys, I'd like you guys to do a journal entry, and again, you can pause after this. I'm going to keep going, obviously, but what I need you to do in your journals is to think about what you know about the Civil War, what you learned in your social studies class about the North and South in general. At the beginning of this war, I need you to list 3 advantages that you think the North had, and then 3 advantages that you think the South had at the beginning of this war. And after you list 3 advantages, I need you to list 3 disadvantages. What are some things you think each side was going to struggle with in a war against the other? And finally, once you have the lists compiled, advantages and disadvantages, hopefully most Americans know who won this war already, but just think about which side should have won this war on paper, which side should have won this war based on the list that you made, and then back up why you made your choice. And so basically it shouldn't take maybe a paragraph max in order to do this. So at this time, if you want to pause the video to go ahead and do your journal entry, that would be fantastic. So as the troops, as both sides were gathering their armies, most Americans at the time thought that this war, and I put that in quotes here, was only going to be 90 days. Lincoln asked for 75,000 volunteers to join for 90 days. Very few people in America thought this was going to be a long, dragged out war, killing hundreds of thousands of men. They thought it would be two angry people getting in a fight, and then that would be it. After the fight was over, everybody would just kiss and make up, and that would be it. So both sides are creating armies, gearing up for the battle that was going to be this war. The call in the North became on to Richmond as the armies were training in Washington. In fact, they were training on the White House grounds. Some soldiers slept in the East Room of the White House, getting ready, learning how to be soldiers. Most of these kids were just kids. They weren't really soldiers. They didn't know what they were doing. They weren't well trained. And both armies, the North and the South. But in Washington, the commander of the Northern Army was a gentleman named Irvin McDowell. And he kept telling President Lincoln, we're not ready. We're not ready to go. Lincoln kept saying, come on, we need you to get to Richmond. Get to Richmond. And McDowell, we're not ready. We're too green. And Lincoln started to get pretty impatient. And finally, in early July of 1861, Lincoln pretty much ordered McDowell. He said, you are green, it is true. But they are green also. You are all green alike. And so he pretty much ordered McDowell to march on Richmond. And so he did. The Union Army leaves Washington heading towards Richmond. They get about 25 miles outside of the capital of Washington into the Virginia countryside near a village called Centerville, closer actually to a village called Manassas. And as the Union Army approaches a small stream that crosses the road called Bull Run, on the other side of the stream was a 35,000 man Confederate army. And this sets the stage for July 21st, 1861. This is the first major land battle of the Civil War. It is called the Battle of Bull Run. In the South, they call it the Battle of Manassas. It is a confusing, chaotic battle between a bunch of soldiers that aren't really soldiers yet. In the morning, the Union is doing really well. They drive the Confederates from the field, but instead of chasing them, they stop to collect souvenirs. And the Confederates regroup and attack later in the afternoon. The Union counterattacks. This goes on and on pretty much all afternoon. At one point late in the afternoon, the Confederate soldiers, some of them are beginning to retreat, and one of the commanders of a Southern force sees his men running, and he's trying to get them to stop. And in order to get them to stop, he notices a general up the hill several hundred yards away who is not retreating. This guy's name is Thomas Jackson. And this general down the hill, trying to get his guys to stop running, basically says, men, stop. There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians. And his men stop running. They turn around, counterattack. And at the same time, there's a cavalry assault on the right flank of the Confederates. Long story short, the Union Army starts to retreat now late in the day. And it gets pretty bad. There were some people from Washington that came out to watch because why not, right? If nothing else to do that day. And the retreating army ended up running right through their picnic ground, and the Union Army flees all the way back to Washington. It is an absolute disaster for the Union, and this is the Battle of Bull Run. All right, so just several details there, but what you need to know about the battle is the significance. Why was this battle important? Several reasons. Number one, this was an absolute disaster for the Union. But the major thing that going forward, and the thing you probably should know about the Battle of Bull Run is this battle proves that this war is not going to be a short one. After the Battle of Bull Run, both sides gear up for the long haul. They are not going to mess around with kids. They're not going to send kids out into the field to fight each other. They are going to train actual armies, and it's going to be an absolute 4-year-long bloodbath from here on out. All right, so that's Bull Run. Moving on to the Battle of Shiloh. As the war intensifies, moving into the year 1862, military planners divide the United States map into 3 distinct areas of war, which they call theaters of war. The East, which is everything from the Atlantic to the Appalachian Mountains, the Western Theater, which is everything from the Appalachians to the Mississippi River, and everything across the Mississippi River, which they call the Trans-Mississippi. All right. Early in 1862, there is a Union Army that had captured Forts Donelson and Henry, which allowed Nashville to be captured by the Union. This army was commanded by Ulysses S. Grant. He was rapidly becoming a pretty famous dude. He is ordered to go capture the Confederate Army, which is camped in a place called Corinth, Mississippi. It's about 5 miles south of the Tennessee-Mississippi border in western Tennessee. And so he takes his army down there, and he is camped on the Tennessee River east of Memphis. And on April 6th and 7th, we have what becomes known as the Battle of Shiloh. Shiloh is an absolute bloodbath. It is the first major battle in the Western theater. And there's a video. I have a video that accompanies this. And so we're going to take a couple minutes here and watch the video.
Shiloh is said to be Hebrew for place of peace, but it becomes the site of one of the deadliest conflicts of the Civil War. Fought in the quiet corner of Tennessee, it is the first major battle in the war's Western theater. In April of 1862, a Union army under General Ulysses S. Grant is camped out along the Tennessee River, awaiting the arrival of reinforcements before heading south to attack the Confederates. But Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnson attacks first.
The Union forces are so unprepared that they're actually still making their breakfast. Some of them are still sleeping in their tents, and they are almost completely overrun by this surprise attack.
The Confederates drive the Union Army back toward the Tennessee River, threatening to destroy it. But the Union line holds at a critical point that becomes known as the Hornet's Nest.
And this is where Grant, in the midst of this Confederate offensive, turns to his commander, Benjamin Prentiss, and says, "You have got to hold this position at all costs." And Prentiss and his men do just that. By the end of the day, the ground is littered with dead. It is probably one of the most fierce points of concentrated fighting in the entire war.
General Johnson is killed in the first day's fighting, and General Pierre G.T. Beauregard takes over, confident he will sweep the field the next day. But reinforcements swell Grant's ranks during the night, and he launches a counterattack in the morning. The result is a Union victory, but one that comes at a high price.
The cost was greater than any battle that had been fought so far in the war. And it demonstrated that the North, it demonstrated that Grant was willing to pay whatever price was necessary to achieve his goal. And once that baseline had been established, then the Union victory was assured, because Union resources, Union manpower were much greater than those available to the Confederacy. The only question was, would the Union be willing to expend it? And Shiloh suggested that yes, the Union would.
All right, that's a really brief video on the Battle of Shiloh. I'm gonna go ahead and get back here. So what can we say was the significance of this battle? At the time it was fought, the Battle of Shiloh was the bloodiest battle in American history. Of course, it wouldn't be for long. There were several other battles later on that were even larger and bloodier. But at the time, this really shocked the nation, something fierce. 23,000 casualties in 2 days. Another significance that the Union helps get a firmer grip on the state of Tennessee, and also help them with their strategy of controlling and capturing and controlling the entire length of the Mississippi River. And so that is a huge significance of this battle. But I would say, by and large, at least as far as the state of Tennessee is concerned, Ulysses S. Grant is rapidly becoming one of Lincoln's best generals, and he becomes a national hero after the Battle of Shiloh. And so that's the Battle of Shiloh. Moving on to the following, well, we're not going to following. We're going to go to the east. Shiloh was fought in the Western Theater in Tennessee, heading back to the east. Very different war in the east. The Confederacy now has a new general in charge of their Eastern Army. His name is Robert E. Lee. He took over for Joseph Johnston during the Battle of 7 Days, won a huge victory there, followed it up with another huge victory at the Second Battle of Bull Run, and Robert E. Lee is rapidly becoming a famous figure in the South. Robert E. Lee, in the late summer of 1862, decides that, these Virginia farmers, their farms have been run over the entire war so far. Most of this war was fought in Virginia, and 100,000 men armies eat a lot. So the farms have been worn out. And so Lee wants to take some of the pressure off the Virginia farmers. And who knows, if he can win a victory on Northern soil, this war is probably going to end. So in the summer of 1862, Lee decides he's going to invade the North. He takes his army and marches them north into Maryland. He's heading for Pennsylvania. The Union general, now in command, McDowell got fired, is a general named George McClellan, who is notorious for being overcautious. He's the kind of guy that he's really good at creating an army, but he just doesn't want to use it. He's always afraid that the enemy has twice as many men as he does, and so he's a very cautious man. McClellan is ordered to find Lee and destroy him. And as the Northern Army is marching north into Maryland, McClellan gets one of the craziest breaks you're ever going to hear of. A courier sent from General Lee with his marching orders wrapped around 3 cigars. The cigars in the marching orders fall out of the courier's saddlebag, and these orders are found by a couple Union soldiers, and they immediately take him to McClellan's headquarters. And now McClellan knows not only where Lee is, but more importantly, where he's going to be. And so, McClellan basically writes to Lincoln saying, if I can't whip Bobby Lee here, I'm just going to come home. And so he marches his army towards a village in Maryland called Sharpsburg, near a stream called Antietam Creek. And so we have on September 17th, 1862, the Battle of Antietam. And I have a brief video for you guys to check out regarding the Battle of Antietam.
It is the bloodiest single day in American military history. The date is September 17th, 1862. The Battle, Antietam. Confederate General Robert E. Lee is invading the North for the first time in search of a decisive victory. Opposing him is Union General George McClellan, one of the most overcautious commanders ever to wear Union blue. But his customary caution evaporates when a Union soldier finds a copy of the marching orders for Lee's army wrapped around 3 cigars.
It's essentially like finding the playbook on the eve of the Super Bowl of your opponent. McClellan gets these plans and he says, I have here in my hand the battle plans with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will go home.
His army confronts Lee at the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland, along Antietam Creek. Fighting in the morning centers around a cornfield that is soon strewn with dead. A church on the battlefield, known as the Dunkard Church, is riddled with bullets. Late in the day, the left wing of the Union Army under General Ambrose Burnside charges across a stone bridge and breaks the Confederate line. A Union victory is in sight.
And then at the very great moment of peril, seemingly out of nowhere, General A.P. Hill, who's been marching his men as fast as he can all day, arrives just in the nick of time, right here on the southern end of the battle line, able to shore up Confederate forces and then ultimately to repulse General Burnside's offensive.
23,000 men are killed, wounded, or missing after 12 hours of savage fighting. Though it ends in stalemate, the battle turns back the Confederate invasion and gives Abraham Lincoln the opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation.
And he wanted to issue his proclamation earlier, but he feared that it would be seen as an act of desperation. The Union armies had not been doing well. He needed something that he could call a victory to show that this is what would follow from a Union victory. Antietam was by no means a clear-cut victory, but it was enough for Lincoln.
Issued a week after the battle, the proclamation's stirring words declare that slaves in the South would be thenceforward and forever free.
All right, so that's the Battle of Antietam. Crazy significance here. This is one of the most important battles of the war. Several minor things, well, minor for most people. Lee's invasion ends after the Battle of Antietam. This battle was it was a tie. It was a draw. It's hard to say that this was a Union victory. These two armies just kind of slugged it out all day. But the next day, Lee retreated back to Virginia. Therefore, we say that it was a Union victory. The key to this is the two major significances that you're going to need to know. Number one is this battle allows Lincoln to actually issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Proclamation. This is a document that freed the slaves in the southern states. It allowed former slaves to join the Union Army, which would obviously help their cause, but it was also a war measure to keep Europe out of the war. He had written it several weeks prior to the Battle of Antietam, but he was waiting for a victory. If you issue this after defeat, it just sounds like the last desperate cry of a weak man. So he had to wait for a victory, which is what Antietam became for him. And so he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And also this day, September 17th, now we celebrate it as Constitution Day, and rightfully so. But it is also, it is, and I pray to God always will be, the bloodiest day in American history. Upwards of 27,000 casualties in one day. All right. At this time, guys, you guys need to find the Emancipation Proclamation from the KCS website. I believe there's some guiding questions that go along with it. If you could go ahead and read the Emancipation Proclamation and answer the guiding questions, that would be outstanding. And obviously, if you need to pause the video at this time, please do so. On to 1863. Another year has passed, and the fighting just kept continuing. There were several battles that we haven't talked about. Robert E. Lee has become even more famous. In May of 1863, he fights what most historians call his masterpiece. It's the Battle of Chancellorsville. He absolutely destroys Joseph Hooker, who was the new commander of the Union Army at the time. It's one of the greatest military victories of all time. It's still studied in military colleges. But he does lose Stonewall Jackson. His #1 lieutenant is accidentally shot by his own men and dies of pneumonia a couple weeks later. And so it's a costly masterpiece. But after the Battle of Chancellorsville, the Union Army is demoralized. Lee sees this as another opportunity to invade the North. And so he takes his army and marches them up into Pennsylvania. The Union commander Hooker is fired, and he is replaced by a Pennsylvania general named George Meade just a couple of days prior to the fighting. And so both armies meander up into Pennsylvania, and they bump into each other in a sleepy little town in south central Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. And on July 1st, they start shooting at each other. Upwards of 160,000 men hear the firing, and unlike you and I would run from gunfire. They run to it. And so we have the greatest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. And again, I have a very short video describing the Battle of Gettysburg for you to watch.
On the first 3 days of July 1863, Union and Confederates meet in one of the most pivotal confrontations of the Civil War. The battle is Gettysburg. Confederate General Robert E. Lee heads north on a last-ditch quest for a decisive victory.
It would be very easy for Northerners to go along with the war if all the fighting took place elsewhere. But if there's fighting in the North, if there's damage to the North, if there's a threat to the North, then Northerners might well feel, okay, time has come to compromise this and to get out of this war.
At Gettysburg, he confronts Union forces under the command of General George Meade, who took over just days before. The battle is a symphony in 3 parts. On day 1, the two armies collide just west of Gettysburg. Southerners drive Northern soldiers back to a position along a low hill known as Cemetery Ridge. On day 2, the Union holds off ferocious Confederate assaults on both flanks. Places with names like Little Round Top and Devil's Den are the scene of fierce fighting. And that sets the stage for day 3. When Lee launches 12,000 men into the Union center, Pickett's charge becomes the most famous and futile attack in Civil War history. Infantry under General George Pickett must cross more than a mile of farm fields under withering artillery fire to reach the Union position.
It's heroic, it's incredibly brave, and it's very, very gallant, and will go down in history as one of the great moments of the war. But in pure terms of the battle, it's absolute suicide.
Lee's defeated army retreats south the next day. Never again will the Confederates threaten the North. 4 months later, Abraham Lincoln comes to Gettysburg to help dedicate the cemetery built to hold those who died in the battle. In his 2-minute address, he honors those who gave the last full measure of devotion that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
So obviously, again, there's several different significant things that that occurred during this battle, but the big ones that you're probably going to need to know are that this becomes the turning point of the entire Civil War. Things were not going well for the North. This was the largest Union victory of the war, and it came the day before another significant victory over on the Mississippi River at Vicksburg, when Grant won the siege of Vicksburg over John Pemberton. But Gettysburg was the turning point of the war in the East. 53,000 casualties in 3 days. And again, casualties are killed, wounded, and missing. But the other significant thing about the Battle of Gettysburg is it set the stage for one of the most famous speeches ever uttered by a human being, the Gettysburg Address. At this time, I would like you guys to do another document analysis. You've already done the Emancipation Proclamation. Now you should have a copy of the Gettysburg Address. If you could take a moment to read it, it's not a long one. Take a moment to read the speech and answer the guiding questions. And obviously you can pause the video at this time. And we'll see you guys on the other side. All right, guys, the last thing we're going to talk about is technically not a battle, it's a place. It's a little village in Virginia. It's known as Appomattox Courthouse. Everybody seems to think it's just a building, but it's the whole village. It's called Appomattox Courthouse. The situation late in the war is Grant, after this victory at Vicksburg, he wins another victory at Chattanooga. He becomes the man for Abraham Lincoln, and he is promoted to command all Union soldiers. And he decides to go fight Robert E. Lee along with George Meade. Throughout the summer of 1864, Grant's army and Lee's army, they slam into each other every day. Eventually, Grant pushes Lee into the town of Petersburg, Virginia, and there surrounds him. And so we have what they call in history the Siege of Petersburg. The siege lasts almost 9 months. By April of 1865, Lee's men are starving. He's not getting reinforcements. When he loses a man, he's gone. And so the men in the trenches around Petersburg for Lee are hungry. And in some places, you have one man patrolling almost a quarter mile of trench. Grant's army is getting bigger every day. His men are well fed, well supplied. Anyhow, on April 2nd, 1865, Robert E. Lee writes the Confederate president saying that he cannot stay where he is anymore. Grant was getting around his corner, his flank. And so Robert E. Lee asks that the government in Richmond take off. They have to evacuate the capital. And Robert E. Lee decides to try to escape. And he takes his army out of Petersburg and he races off to the west, trying to find some supplies. His eventual goal is to somehow try to get down into North Carolina and hook up with Joe Johnston to keep fighting. As soon as he leaves and heads west, Grant takes his army and follows. And so the great chase is on. The chase lasts for about a week. And on April 9th, 1865, the chase ends. Grant's army arrives in Appomattox Courthouse before Robert E. Lee does. And Lee has no choice but to ask Grant to meet him for the purpose of surrendering his army. Which happens on April 9th, 1865. Robert E. Lee surrenders to Grant, and that is what you need to know about Appomattox Courthouse. All right, the significance of this, the largest army of the Confederacy is done. They're surrendered. They're out of the war. Robert E. Lee, the most famous man in the South, decides to go home. The significance of Appomattox Courthouse is this is where Lee surrendered to Grant. A lot of people say that this is where the war was ended. There were other Southern armies in the field that still had to surrender. That was going to take a couple more weeks. But, Appomattox Courthouse, you could say effectively, that's why I italicized that word, ended the Civil War. All right? And so that's Appomattox Courthouse. And that's pretty much it, guys. We talked about Bull Run, Shiloh, Antietam, Gettysburg, and Appomattox Courthouse. I have the next slide is it's a PDF of what your card sort's going to look like. I'm going to get my ugly mug out of the way there so you can see it. Basically, you print that out, cut them out. You see the battles up at the top there. There's the 4 battles and then the other things that deal with it. Cut them out and put the descriptions on the correct battle. And hopefully you'll have some fun with that. Get your parents involved with that. But I hope you guys enjoyed a very brief tour of some of the battles of the Civil War. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. It's mark.chenot@knoxschools.org. I hope you guys have an awesome day. You can take care of yourselves and have a great summer, and hopefully we'll all be back in the fall. Bye-bye.